As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall.
The gates of Rosewood Palace have never felt heavier than they do tonight. Not since the Great Renunciation of 1911, when King Alaric's own great-grandfather surrendered his throne rather than divide his people, has the kingdom of Aldenmere stood at such a crossroads. But what unfolded behind those iron gates in the past several weeks makes even that old story feel like a rehearsal for something far more personal, far more raw. King Alaric III, the man who waited nearly 6 decades for a crown that seemed at times as if it might never come to him. The man who buried his father in a driving rainstorm and carried the weight of a restless nation on shoulders that had grown tired long before the crown ever touched his head, has decided to do what none of his advisors thought he had the will to do. He is stepping down, not quietly, not through a whispered statement issued by a palace press office at dawn. King Alaric is preparing to stand before his people and deliver a final address, a farewell that will formally open the reign of King Edmund and Queen Alara. But the version of events the palace will release to the newspapers is not the whole story. The real account of this abdication did not begin in a throne room hung with tapestries and lit by chandeliers. It began in a private drawing room, with a queen consort who refused to accept the shrinking of her own influence, a son who discovered a strength he did not know he carried, and a king who finally found, late in life, the resolve he had spent decades searching for. To understand why Alaric chose to lay down his crown, you first have to understand what wearing it actually cost him. He was never raised to be a comfortable monarch. He was raised to wait, through the long, slow years of his mother's illness, through a marriage that collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny, through the loss of a beloved sister in a car accident that the tabloids picked over for a decade. Alaric waited, patient, disciplined, enduring in the way that royal children are taught to endure, by simply refusing to let anyone see the toll it takes. When his father, King Edric, finally died after a long illness, Alaric was 58 years old, already older than many monarchs are when their reigns end. His coronation, held in the ancient cathedral of Fenwick, was magnificent. Gold thread and candlelight, choirs whose voices seemed to rise into the very stones of the building. For a moment, it appeared as though this careful, guarded, often misunderstood man had finally found his place. But almost immediately, the shadows gathered. Whispers about his health, long dismissed by palace officials as nothing more than the ordinary aches of late middle age, became impossible to ignore. A diagnosis, delivered quietly to a small circle of family and doctors, sent a current of alarm through the institution. The king was mortal, and everyone around him understood, perhaps for the first time, that the question of succession was no longer a distant abstraction. It was urgent. Layered on top of this were fractures within the family itself that had been widening for years, hidden beneath state dinners and carefully managed photographs. Alaric's younger brother had left the family's public duties behind entirely, trading royal obligation for a quieter life abroad, and the tabloids never let the family forget it. Meanwhile, Prince Edmund and Princess Alara, the young heir and his wife, had weathered their own private storm, a serious illness of Alara's that had, against the odds, drawn the public closer to them rather than pushing them away. Their careful, dignified return to public life after her recovery had done something remarkable. The people were not simply tolerating the young couple. They were falling for them, in a way that reminded the older generation of a beloved princess from decades before. Alaric saw it. Of course he saw it. And in the long, sleepless nights at his country estate, a single question must have circled endlessly through his mind. At what point does a king's greatest act of service become the act of stepping aside entirely? Nothing about what happened next was ever announced. There were no calendar entries, no advance notice sent through official channels. And yet, inside a private meeting room at Rosewood Palace, a gathering took place that would alter the direction of the monarchy for a generation. The room itself seemed to understand the gravity of what was coming. Portraits of long-dead kings and queens looked down from the walls, silent witnesses to centuries of triumph and catastrophe. Around the long table sat the people Alaric had spent his reign trying to hold together. Prince Edmund arrived with the composed bearing of a man who already sensed something significant was about to happen. Beside him sat Princess Alara, radiating the quiet calm that had become her hallmark, hands folded in her lap. And across the table sat Queen Isolde, Alaric's second wife, a woman who had spent 2 decades transforming her public image from a source of scandal into something closer to acceptance. Alaric rose to speak, and from his very first words, the room understood this was no routine briefing. His voice was low and steady, but carried something none of them had heard in it before, a finality that could not be walked back. He spoke of duty, of time, of the invisible toll that illness places on a sovereign who refuses to acknowledge his own limits. And then he said it plainly. He intended to abdicate, to transfer the crown to Edmund and Alara while he was still able to witness the transition and ensure it was built on solid ground. The room did not erupt. It fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the mantel clock sounded like distant thunder. Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Alara's composure held, but her eyes betrayed the truth. This was real, and it was happening now. Then came a sound that shattered the stillness, a chair scraping hard against the stone floor. Queen Isolde rose to her feet. The woman who stood was not the careful, diplomatically warm figure the public had grown accustomed to seeing at state functions. This was someone else entirely. Her voice, when it came, carried the practiced authority of someone who had spent years learning how to frame personal objection as public wisdom. Edmund, she argued, was too young, too unseasoned in the delicate traditions that formed the true foundation of the crown. The timing, she insisted, was recklessly premature. The words were built to sound reasonable, but the room was watching her hands, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the faint tremor at the corner of her mouth. These were not the gestures of a concerned stateswoman. They were the gestures of someone watching her own carefully constructed position dissolve in real time. Because the truth understood by everyone present, though spoken by no one, was this: Isolde's influence, her relevance, her very identity within the institution had been built entirely around her closeness to Alaric. Remove his power, hand it to Edmund, and what exactly would remain for her? Her outburst landed like a blade through silk. Alaric stood frozen for a long moment. This was not a rival courtier or a hostile columnist challenging him. This was his wife, the woman who had stood beside him through years of public judgment, now undermining him in front of his son and daughter-in-law, in front of the very people to whom he was trying to pass the most important trust of his life. It was Edmund who moved first. He rose without drama, crossed to his father's side, and in the calm, measured tone of a man already operating with quiet authority, announced that the meeting would adjourn so that everyone could reflect. It was graceful, it was decisive, and it sent an unmistakable message. As Isolde swept from the room, everyone remaining understood one thing with total clarity. Nothing inside Rosewood Palace would be quite the same again. The door to the king's private study closed behind him with the weight of a verdict. Inside, the familiar smell of old books and cedar did nothing to settle him. He stood with his back to the door, shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man who has just experienced a betrayal so deep his body has not yet found language for it. Isolde had followed him. She stood in the center of the room, chin lifted in the manner she had perfected over the years, the posture of a woman accustomed to being heard. But her eyes told a different story. Beneath the performance of confidence was real fear, the kind that surfaces when someone realizes they have pushed a moment past the point of repair. What she said next, according to those who were later told of it in confidence, represents perhaps the most consequential misjudgment of her time in the family. She reached back into the most private corners of Alaric's history, his difficult childhood at a distant boarding school, the isolation he had described to almost no one but her in their quietest hours together, and made clear, through implication rather than open threat, that those private memories need not remain private. It was a threat, and it did not break him. It rebuilt him. He turned to face her, and the eyes that met hers were not the eyes of the man she believed she knew. The old need for her approval, the old vulnerability, had vanished. In its place was something harder and entirely final. He understood, perhaps in that very instant, that she had not been the refuge he once believed her to be. He said nothing further. He walked to his desk, picked up his pen, and began to write. Later that night, long after the palace had gone quiet, Alaric walked its corridors with a different bearing altogether, the old hesitancy gone, replaced by something the walls had rarely heard from him before. He made his way to his son's private study. When Edmund opened the door, there was no formal greeting, no careful preamble. Alaric sat and told him everything, every detail of what Isolde had said, every implied threat, every private memory she had reached for in her attempt to pull him back from the decision he had made. He spoke plainly, without the usual protective varnish families like his applied to moments of dysfunction. Edmund listened with remarkable stillness, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, the only outward sign of the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. In his father, he saw two things at once: a sovereign who had just endured a genuine betrayal of trust, and a father flawed and human, finally closing an emotional distance that had defined their entire relationship. What passed between them that night was not simply political strategy. It was the transfer of real trust between two men who had spent a generation misunderstanding one another. Edmund did not merely offer sympathy. He began, almost immediately, to plan the guest list for the next meeting, the framing of the eventual public announcement, the quiet management of the family's response. The sharp, decisive mind he had kept carefully hidden behind a mild public image was suddenly fully visible. By the time dawn found them still working, Alaric placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture so rare between them that it landed like an oath. The succession, in every way that mattered, had already happened, not in a throne room, but in a lamplit study in the quiet hours before sunrise. The second family meeting bore no resemblance to the first. Where that one had been raw and unplanned, this one was deliberate down to the smallest detail: the seating chart, the documents laid out on the table, who would be included and who would find themselves quietly excluded from the inner circle. Queen Isolde arrived in a deep green gown, clearly chosen with care, the armor of a woman who understood that appearances were now the only leverage she had left. But the moment she saw the seating arrangement, Edmund and Alara positioned closer to the king than she was, the color drained from her composed expression. She searched the room for allies and found none. The quiet solidarity she once commanded had evaporated overnight. Alaric rose to speak, and the change from the first meeting was total. His voice held no tremor of personal emotion. He restated his intention to abdicate and laid out the transition in specific, irreversible terms. He did not once look toward Isolde. That deliberate absence, so unlike decades of habit, was itself the loudest statement in the room. Isolde tried briefly to signal her opposition, a slight shake of her head, a calculated sigh, timed to interrupt his rhythm. But when her eyes met Edmund's, she stopped. What she saw there was not the look of a threatened son, but of a woman watching a political miscalculation unfold in real time, delivered without malice, but without mercy either. One by one, the rest of the family signaled quiet agreement. No one rose in her defense. The room had already reached its verdict before Alaric finished speaking. The formal document was placed on the table, and Edmund accepted it from his father with a visible respect that moved even the most composed observers in the room. Word of the abdication reached the public through a carefully managed announcement, timed and worded with the precision the monarchy always applies to its most consequential moments. King Alaric would speak to the nation directly, a final address, closing a reign defined as much by patience as by its unexpected act of self-sacrifice at the very end. On the morning of the broadcast, the palace held a different kind of stillness, the quiet of people aware they were living through history. Alaric dressed simply, not in ceremonial regalia, but in something closer to what he might have worn on an ordinary morning, the clothing of a man not performing power, but setting it down with grace. He stood before the cameras and spoke of duty not as an abstraction, but as a daily practice of placing responsibility above personal comfort. He spoke of Edmund and Alara with a warmth that surprised even those who knew him best, describing the sharpness of his son's mind, the steadiness of his daughter-in-law's character, and the way together they made an old institution feel human without making it feel diminished. He said the decision was not a retreat, but the greatest act of service he had left to offer, to step aside while he could still witness the foundation being laid. He did not mention Isolde. Her name did not appear once in the address, and in that silence, the public understood everything they needed to understand about what had happened behind the palace walls. He closed not with ceremony, but with something closer to reflection, telling his people that the crown's true strength had never rested in the person wearing it, but in those who stood beneath it. Then he stepped back from the podium, and the reign was over. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of the monarchy moved forward with the unhurried precision of an institution that has performed this ritual for centuries. Coronation dates were set. Protocols were confirmed. Alaric retreated to his country estate, where those closest to him describe a visible, long-absent relief, long walks, quiet mornings, sleep that had eluded him for years. The man who had waited nearly 6 decades to become king had worn the crown for barely a handful of years, and yet the earliest judgments of history suggested that his defining act as monarch might be this, recognizing the precise moment when stepping forward required stepping aside. Isolde withdrew to a private residence in the countryside. The separation, never formally announced and never denied, simply became a fact of life the palace neither confirmed nor addressed. She continued to appear at a handful of public and charitable events, composed as ever, but the rooms she moved through were quieter than before, and the warmth that had once defined her place in the family had cooled in ways everyone noticed, and no one discussed. Edmund and Alara stepped into their new roles with a confidence that seemed to have been building for years, waiting for its moment. Their public appearances now carried a different kind of energy, not merely symbols of the crown, but 2 specific, known, deeply human people carrying real weight, and carrying it well. The question that lingers, even as coronation preparations move forward, is not really about politics or protocol. It is about what happens when the personal and the public collide at the highest level, and about the cost of keeping an old institution alive inside a modern world that has grown far less patient with the gap between appearance and truth. Alaric gave up his crown, but before he did, he gave up something harder still, the belief that even hard-won, deeply guarded love is enough to survive once the true nature of a relationship has been revealed.